what's really cool is about both of these songs is the later guys sampled from the earlier guys and brought their beat in. And so depending on your generation, you may recognize one song more than the other, or you picked up on the pattern in the second song. What's really cool is the Bible does the exact same thing. And we have this cool little graphic to look at that actually, I found this a while ago. This actually shows, if you start here on this end, this is the book of Genesis at the beginning of the Bible. You can see this long line here. This is the Psalms, all the way to Revelation. And all of these lines represent cross-references throughout the Bible. If you really focus in on it, you can see smaller lines at the bottom, but you can see all the way from Genesis to Revelation. There's so many times where the Bible samples itself and begins to say, hey, you remember this song? Well, it's actually, we're going to take that and we're going to segue it into something else. So, I love this graphic. It's one of my favorites. So, if the Bible does the same thing, I want to dig into today's song and start looking at it. So let's pull up Psalm 51. That's where we're going to be at today. If you have your Bible, you can open it up, but we'll also have it on the screen. So in Psalms 51, to the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. So we're going to pause right here. Out of 150 psalms, there's only a handful of the psalms that actually kind of give you the context of what's going on here. I don't know the exact number, but it's a small amount. This is one of those. And so right here at the beginning, it tells you, hey, this is what's going on before we get into the psalm. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit. So if you're reading through 2 Samuel, you get to chapter 11, and you have the story of David. And David is hanging out in Jerusalem, and he's actually in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because chapter 11 starts out by saying that during the springtime when kings would go to war, David was at home in Jerusalem. And so right off the bat, it kind of sets you up to say, hey, David's not where he's supposed to be. Well, as David is hanging out while everybody else is out at war, he happens to look out and he sees this woman named Bathsheba doing a ritual bath. And that actually comes into play a little bit later on in the story. She's not just hanging out taking a bath, she's actually doing a ritual bath that goes back to the story of Leviticus. It's, her time of month, and she's cleaning afterwards. And so David sees her, sees that she looks good, and so he's like, hey, who's that woman over there? Well, word gets back to him, and the first thing that's said about her is, hey, that's Uriah's wife, Uriah that actually fights for you and is out at battle. So David decides, hey, I like this girl, I like the way she looks. He brings her back to the palace. Well, lo and behold, Bathsheba winds up pregnant. Now, at this point, David's like, I got to cover this up. So he reaches out and has Uriah come back in from the battle. And he sends Uriah home to be with his wife. Now, at this point in the story, Uriah is actually more responsible than David. And Uriah says, no, I can't do that. Because all of my brothers are out here fighting for their lives. Who am I to go home and be with my wife? They can't. Why should I be able to? And so Uriah actually sleeps at the palace gates and refuses to go home. Well, David has a mistake that he's got to cover up. And so David says, all right, well, we'll try this a different way. Uriah, come on back inside. We're going to throw a party. And he gets Uriah drunk, thinking, okay, if I get him drunk, maybe he'll go home. And Uriah gets drunk, but he's not too drunk. He still goes and sleeps outside the gates and refuses to go home. So now David's like, oh crap, I've really got this mistake I've got to cover up, and I can't do it this way. So he sends Uriah back to the battlefield with a note in his hand. And the note is for Uriah's commander to put Uriah on the front of the battlefield. And once the battle gets really intense, everybody to pull back and leave Uriah there to die. And that does happen. The commander takes the king's word and does exactly what he's supposed to. And not only Uriah, but a lot of other Israelites get killed that day. Once the story comes back to David, David then allows Bathsheba the appropriate amount of time to mourn the loss of her husband before he brings her into the palace and makes her his wife. So, it's probably not too surprising. God was not pleased with this. And so God sends the prophet Nathan in to tell David, hey, look, you've messed up. You've messed up big time. And we see in 2 Samuel 12, verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. After Nathan calls him out, David immediately goes and says, no, I have sinned. I've messed up. And so now we understand the context of what's going on before we get into this psalm. And so let's read through Psalms 51 together and see what it is that David says during this time. David starts by saying, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from the blood guiltiness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Do good to Zion in your good pleasure, and build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. So David was a very musical guy, and he knew how to write a song. And in this moment of his life, this is the song that he writes. As he's been called out for his sin, this is what he writes. Now, I'm a very analytical person. For anybody that knows me, I'm going to go deep on this. And so what I want to do is I want to look at the structure of this psalm. And so if we look at all 19 verses, what we notice is that God, just like MC Hammer did, just like Vanilla Ice did, David pulls in and samples what he knows of the existing scriptures. And so we see where these scriptures have been pulled in, and this is what David uses to start building his song. This is a structure, this is the beat that he's actually going back to. Well, what's cool is that David has 73 of the 150 psalms attributed to him. So a lot of these songs will kind of riff off of each other, but they also riff off of what's going on in David's life during the time of 1 and 2 Samuel, which records his life. And so we actually see where those psalms kind of get pulled from in regards to this one. Now, this is a pivotal moment in David's life. David was a king of Israel, and he is known as being the king of Israel. And so, with this moment in David's life being so life-changing, not only for David, but for the whole nation of Israel, we see the later prophets also begin riffing off of this psalm, and we see how it fills out a little bit more. David also is the ancestor of Jesus. And so when we get into the New Testament, a lot of the New Testament authors start referring back to things that happened in David's life. They start looking back at who David was and what he was singing about and the songs that he had in his head. And so we see that it fills in even more. And so what's really cool is if you think back to that graphic that I showed at the beginning, this is just one psalm out of the Bible, and you can see so many cross-references going in and coming out of it. Sorry. So the very first thing we want to look at is, let's get back to the beginning. Let's see where David starts his psalm. And so in Psalm 51:1, he says, have mercy on me, O God. So right now, at this point in David's life, he has not only committed adultery, but he's tried to cover it up. And in covering it up, he has also committed murder. Not just with one guy, Uriah, but with numerous people. And so, of course, the first thing David wants to ask for is mercy. But what we see is he says, have mercy on me according to your steadfast love. And so what David is actually doing is he's actually leaning into God's character. Well, we can find God's character in Exodus chapter 34. So in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And so what's going on in this story is God is actually the one that's speaking, and he's speaking to Moses. So if you go all the way back to the time of Exodus, God decides, hey, I'm going to call this people, the Israelites, my people. They are currently in slavery in Egypt, and God says, I'm going to bring you out of Egypt, and I'm going to lead you to this promised land. Well, on the way there, they stop at this mountain where God says, hey, at this point, because you're going to be my people and I'm going to be your God, let's go ahead and lay the foundation, and God gives them the 10 Commandments. Well, Moses climbs up on this mountain. He's having this conversation with God, and apparently he's gone too long. The Israelites to say, hey, I don't think he's coming back. We need a God. And so they convince Moses' brother to build them a golden cow statue. And they say this golden cow statue is who rescued us from Egypt and who we're going to worship. It literally breaks the first 2 of the 10 Commandments. And so Moses sees this, and he has to run all the way back up the mountain and plead with God to forgive the people. He's like, don't destroy them. Remember your promises that you've made to Abraham. Remember all the promises you've made to see these people through. You just rescued them out of Egypt. Don't give up on them now. And so God actually tells Moses these words, and he says, this is who I am. I am a God who is slow to anger, who is abounding in love, who is full of mercy. And so what David's doing when he goes into this is we look at Psalm 51:1 again. What he does is he pulls out steadfast love and abundant mercy. He pulls out God's words, and it's almost like he's using God's words against him. But what David's saying is, look, you remember that time that those people broke 2 of your commandments. I realize here that I've messed up. I've broken almost half of your commandments. And so what I need to do is I need you to remember who you are, God, and to have mercy on me because of who you are. Not because I deserve it, but because of who you are. And so by using these words, David is not only pulling this beat into his song, he's also bringing God's memory into it for this time of history. And so forgiveness doesn't come from what we do, but it actually comes from who God is. And so as we continue in the Psalm 51:1 and 2, we see he says, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sins. And David continues on for the next few verses talking about how sinful he is. He's like, look, God, I'm sinful. I'm full of sin. I've done sin. In fact, I was born in sin. Like everything about my life is sin. And we get to verse 9, and in verse 9 he says, hide your face from my sins and blot out all of my iniquities. And so what's really cool is if we look at Psalms 51:1 and 2, and 9, what we see is David has pulled up a lot of these different words. He's pulled up iniquities and sins and transgressions. And all of these words in the original Hebrew, they all have different meanings, but they're different nuances of the same thing. You know, whether it's missing the mark, whether it's just straight evil, or just falling down and not being able to get up. These are all the different terms that David's using to describe his sin. But what I love about these 2 verses is they actually make the sandwich by using this term, blot out. You see that in both the end of 1 and the beginning of 9. And so this actually makes what, I forget what the technical term is, but we'll call it a sandwich. So this brings in verses 1 and 2 and 9, where it's talking about all this sin. But what David begins and ends this whole sandwich with saying is blot out. Now that is actually one term in the Hebrew, and it actually refers back to Genesis chapter 6. So David has started with one beat, but now he's bringing in another beat. And in Genesis 6, 5 through 8, we read, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." Now, I had someone point out to me that what's really interesting about this passage, as dark as it is it never mentions God's wrath. It never says that God was angry or that God was just full of wrath and anger. No, it says that God was sorry. He was heartbroken. These humans that he had created to do life with, to further the creation that he started in Genesis 1:1, these creatures that he had chosen and created to be in relationship with him have chosen evil instead. In fact, so much evil that he just regrets that he even made them. He's so sorry and so heartbroken that he just doesn't even want to deal with it anymore. And so luckily, he finds favor with Noah. But the word that he uses is blot out. And that's the exact same word. And so when you're studying the Bible, there is a rule called the rule of first mentions. And so as we see blot out in Psalms 51:1, you go back to the very first time that word was used in the Bible, which is here in Genesis 6. And that kind of shapes how that term is used. And so when God says he's going to blot out man, what he means is obliterate, to wipe out, like completely and utterly destroy. And so again, when we're looking at David, when we're looking at this time in David's life, what's going on here is David says, look, my evil, my sin, my missing the mark has gotten so great that what I need you to do, God, is I need you to blot it out. I need you to wipe it out, utterly destroy it, obliterate the sin that's in my life. Because I know that I can't move on without you. I need you to just destroy the sin that's in my life. And so it's almost like David, again, has transported himself back into the time of Genesis, and David is looking at God, and he's saying, hey, God, you remember that time that you were so utterly heartbroken with the world because of the evil in it, that you had to rescue one man and his family through a flood that washed away all of that evil? David says, what I need is for you to obliterate the sin in my life, to completely do a God-sized flood and wipe it out and rescue me. Put me in the boat of your salvation and rescue me from the sin that's in my life. And so, as we continue in Psalms 51:10, it's as though this beat continues. And he says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew your right spirit within me. And so what's really cool is if you're reading through the flood story in Genesis chapter 6 through 8, when you start in chapter 9, what happens is Noah, once he's finally able to touch land again and get off the boat, the first thing he does is offer a sacrifice to God. And God blesses Noah, and he tells Noah these words, be fruitful and multiply, which transports you all the way back to Genesis 1, when God created Adam and Eve. When God created the creatures of the sea, the creatures on the land, he tells them all to be fruitful and multiply. And so you see this flood story where God has literally decreated the world, and he starts over with a new creation with Noah, and he says, be fruitful and multiply. And so again, we're following the same beat into this part of the psalm where David says, hey, I need you to create in me a new heart. Now, create, what's really cool about this term create is from the Hebrew term bara. And what it means is actually to create, to shape, to form. but it actually means to create something brand new that was never there before. And what's really cool is in any use of Hebrew, this term can only be used with God as a subject, meaning nobody else can bear us something. Only God can bear us something. And so David says, what I need is, God, for you to create a new heart for me. Because the heart in ancient Israel, the heart was the source of your thoughts, your emotions, your choices. They didn't have an understanding of the brain the same way that we do. They thought everything came from the heart. And so what David's saying is, hey, look, my heart is the source of my choices, is the source of my thoughts that have led to this evil. And so leading to this evil, God, I need you to wipe my heart out. I need you to obliterate it the same way you did my sins and create from scratch a brand new heart that will lean into you, that will love you, that will make choices, that will have thoughts that will line up with who you are. And so verse 10 of this psalm is where we see true repentance. David has said, look, I've had this sin in my life. This sin that has overtaken me, that has caused me to spiral out of control and do things I never thought I was capable of. And what I need you to wipe me out and start over, start fresh, start something new in me. And so as David pulls these samples from Genesis, from Exodus, as he's pulling all these stories, David's pulling these stories that he knows about God. He knows who God is. He knows these stories about God. And I think that's what's so great about coming here every Sunday is we have these stories within this building of people who have gone through storms in their life. Hopefully your life has not spiraled out of control to the point of murder, but if it has, you have these stories within this church building, within this Bible that we study every Sunday. You have these stories to lean in and to sample in your own life. And as we look at what David did, can you say that you sample God's stories into your life? When you're spiraling out of control, how do you get back up? Is it because of the songs that you know? Is it because of the stories that you're familiar with? Is it because you know who God is? And if not, we would love to help you know. We would love to help you get back on your feet through the stories that we can share as a community of believers and through the stories of God.